Thank you all for coming early on a Monday morning at the beginning of the year. I feel like this is extra early. So I'm Colin. I work at Google Brain, and I'm going to be talking about a paper that we put on archive a couple months ago. This was joint work with this amazing team whose names are on the slide here. And I should say that this is the first time that I'm presenting these slides. So if you're confused at any point or something seems unclear, please stop me and ask a question, because someone else is probably confused about the same thing. And it's probably my fault, not yours. So yeah, stop me at any time with questions. And great. So at a high level today, I'll be talking about transfer learning. And I assume that many of the people in the room are already familiar with this stuff, but I'll just mention this to begin with. So, and when I say transfer learning, what I mean is usually starting by training our model in an unsupervised fashion on unlabeled data, and then fine-tuning it on a labeled data set, some task that we actually care about, which I'll call the downstream task. So for example, we might take some text shown in green here, drop out some of the words, and train the model to predict the missing words. That's our unsupervised pre-training task. And then after that's done, we will fine-tune it on a supervised task like sentiment analysis, classifying this blue movie review as a given label. And as we will discuss today, this has become a really incredible recipe for natural language processing. And the work that I'm going to be talking about today follows this recipe pretty closely. So to motivate why this is important, again, I think many people in the room are probably familiar with this, but here are the sort of scores over time for the squad, question answering benchmark on the validation set. And you can see that when the benchmark was proposed, we were having a score of around 70. This is the exact match score, basically saying, does the span predicted by the model exactly match the correct answer? And as happens in many benchmarks, the best score kind of goes up over time. But what I want to emphasize here is that this early chunk did not use transfer learning, and this last chunk did. And you can see there's a pretty huge jump from, let's say, lower than 80 to roughly 90 on this benchmark that at least partially can be attributed to just using transfer learning. And so this is one reason this is such an important part of the modern NLP recipe, because it tends to give good performance. And why it gives good performance, maybe loosely speaking, we could say that by pre-training the model, we're giving the model knowledge about the meaning of words and maybe some world knowledge about different concepts, different facts. And so when we train it on a question answering data set, it has an easier time understanding the questions and maybe finding the answers in the context. And maybe to get people excited, I'll just mention that this first jump was produced by Bert, and our work, at least in this plot, is all the way on the right here. So if you really care about hill climbing and pushing state of the art, then maybe that'll grab your attention. I also should mention that we are very far above human performance on this benchmark, so it's a little funny to get better scores now. But anyways, so to give a bit of a timeline, as many of you know, let's say in 2014, 2015, and around that time, there was a lot of excellent work on learning word vectors, so continuous representations for words, where we mapped the identity of a word to a fixed length vector, which ideally encoded some meaning about the word in a continuous space. And for a long time, or at least since then, that has been a very important part of the NLP pipeline, especially for deep learning models, where you take these pre-trained word vectors, which are typically trained using an unsupervised objective, and you feed them into your model and train, let's say, a classifier on top of the word vectors. Maybe you fine-tune the word vectors a bit, and that kind of was the recipe for a long time. And I should mention, in about 2015, there was a paper by some people who are now my colleagues, called Semi-Supervised Sequence Learning, which presented a slightly different recipe where they pre-trained an LSTM using like an autoencoder or a language modeling objective, and then fine-tuned it on a downstream task, which is really basically the recipe we use today. But the results weren't great. It was sort of preliminary work. People didn't pay a ton of attention to it at the time. And then in 2017, a paper that I personally think is important in helping us move our thinking towards this transfer learning paradigm we use now was the unsupervised sentiment neuron paper from people at OpenAI, which basically showed that by just training a language model on a purely unsupervised objective, the model could learn concepts that were potentially useful for downstream tasks, like, for example, the sentiment of a review. So then in 2018, we had a bunch of super important papers, including the ULM Fit paper from Jeremy Howard and Sebastian Ruder, which basically took the recipe from semi-supervised sequence learning, added some tweaks, figured out how to get it working better, and got some very impressive results with, again, a similar pipeline, pre-training a language model, fine-tuning on a downstream task. And then, of course, we had Elmo from you all, which showed that by using a bidirectional language model, we could get significantly better performance. And then GPT-1 came along, which said that instead of using an LSTM, if we use a transformer, with a language model, we can get good performance. And then finally, in 2018, of course, we had BERT, which showed that a bidirectional transformer could get particularly good performance. And I think by the end of 2018, many people were convinced that this was really the path forward, given all of the impressive results that these papers and a few others showed. So then after that, there really has been an explosion of work on transfer learning for NLP, sort of showing variants of some of these methods, different pre-training ideas, different data sets, different benchmark tasks, including, BERT on stilts, which shows that by using some supervised pre-training can help a little bit. MTDNN showing that doing multitask pre-training can help, and so on. So really a ton of work, especially in the past year, from 2019 to 2020. And yeah, just to emphasize that, I'll say that that was definitely not even close to a comprehensive list of people proposing new paradigms, new ideas for transfer learning for NLP. So things have kind of starting with Word2Vec back in the day, and if you think of the start of this paradigm that we use now in 2015, comparatively speaking, there's been a ton of work, especially recently. And so what tends to happen when there's sort of this explosion of work and interesting results and cool ideas is the following. And I'm just going to give an example. This is not representative of any particular paper. But what tends to happen is that a paper will come along and they'll propose, let's say, an unsupervised pre-training technique called, let's say, Fancy Learn. And another one comes along and says, I have a new unsupervised pre-training technique called Fancier Learn. And the first paper used Wikipedia as their unlabeled data set for pre-training, but the second paper used Wikipedia with the Toronto Books corpus. And Fancier Learn got better results. So is Fancier Learn better than Fancy Learn? Or for example, the second paper that comes along uses a bigger model. Do we know whether Fancier Learn is better than Fancy Learn? Or maybe the second paper pre-trains on more data, or maybe the second paper uses a different optimizer than the first paper. So the point is that basically there is a wide variety of choices that we all make when we create our experimental setup to test our ideas. We present new ideas, but we might change different pieces of the formula, and that can make it hard to decide whether, for example, one unsupervised pre-training technique is better than the other, or some new architecture is better than the other, or whatever idea. And I'm not saying this in a negative way. This kind of happens by necessity, because if papers are coming out every couple of weeks, there's no way to establish sort of a standard practice of how we should be testing all of these new ideas. So, and I should also say that this can become especially difficult if everyone is sort of re-implementing the models, creating their new data set, loading pipelines, etc., because these small implementation details like hyperparameter choices can also have an outsized impact in performance. So we have a bunch of work that happens, and I think this has happened in the past year for transfer learning for NLP. It also happened when people started to get good results using deep networks for computer vision and at other points in time. It can just get a little hard to figure out sort of what works best, what are the most important contributions, and what, if I'm a practitioner, what recipe should I be using, what pieces should I be using. And so given all of this excitement and these cool results, in this paper really we are trying to answer the following questions. We say, given the current landscape, given all of the stuff that already exists, so we're not going to propose anything new, given everything that already exists, what works best? So we're going to take as a bunch of different ideas, apply them in exactly the same framework to the same problems, and measure how well they work. And then, given that we sort of know what works well, what happens when we basically push the current best approaches to their limit? So we're going to train bigger models on more data using the best possible formula we can come up with and see where the field stands. So that's kind of the basic idea and motivation behind the work that I'm going to be talking about today. So the first piece that we introduce to undertake this study is what we call the Text-to-Text Transformer, or T5. And T5 is our model, and it's also our modeling approach. How do we model all of the problems that we're going to be attacking? And the basic idea behind this approach is that we're going to model every NLP problem, every text problem, as a text-to-text task. That is, taking text as input and producing text as output. Okay, so basically in a sequence-to-sequence framework. And so for something like machine translation, this is maybe not that surprising. We've all seen machine translation or sequence-to-sequence applied to machine translation before. You know, we input the English sentence and we get a French sentence out. But because we're using the same model for many tasks, the way that we tell the model which task to perform is by prepending a sort of task prefix, which will also be text. So in this case, we're saying translate English to German, that is good, and then outputs das ist gut. And if we wanted to translate to French, we would say translate English to French, etc. So this is sort of a task prefix that is not exactly a natural language, but is nevertheless provided as just textual input. So this is maybe not that unusual, not that surprising, but what we'll also do is we'll cast classification tasks in this framework. And if we want to do a classification task, what we might do is prepend a task prefix like cola. This is the corpus on linguistic acceptability, where you're given a sentence and you have to decide whether it's linguistically acceptable, so basically grammatically correct or not. And then there's a little prefix telling the model what it's about to be fed, so the sentence to classify. So cola sentence, the course is jumping well, and courses don't jump, so this is not an acceptable sentence. And the model is trained to literally predict the text not acceptable. So usually we wouldn't predict text here. We would usually have, a softmax layer on the output of our model that we train for one or two labels, acceptable, not acceptable. But again, in this framework, we're actually asking the model to predict text. And to go even further, we can also apply this framework to regression problems. For example, for STSB, where we're basically tasked to predict how similar two sentences are, we again feed in the task prefix STSB, sentence 1, the first sentence, sentence 2, the second sentence, and now the model's supposed to predict how similar they are. And in this case, we literally predict the floating point number as text. So we predict the tokens 3:8, okay? And in order to make this maybe a little better constrained for the model, we quantize the possible values that the similarity value can take. So they're in a range between 1 and 5. We quantize them to the nearest 0.2. And so we're kind of first mapping this problem to like a 20 class or 21 class classification problem. And now we're asking the model to predict these sort of little strings that represent floating point numbers. And finally, of course, we can do other sequence-to-sequence tasks like document summarization. So this is an example from the CNN Daily Mail corpus where we're given an article and we're asked to predict the summary. And so again, the important thing here is that yes?
So just to understand, so you're pre-training your model on unsupervised tasks, and then for each fine-tuned task, you pre-process a COLA to add the term COLA something before that, and but this would require supervised fine-tuning for each novel task.
Exactly, yeah. So the basic transfer learning recipe is the same. We're doing unsupervised pre-training followed by fine-tuning. This T5 thing is basically just a way of casting all of the downstream tasks that we care about in exactly the same framework. And yeah, so the reason that this is nice, and the reason that at least I think that it's useful and important, is that every single problem uses exactly the same loss function, exactly the same training procedure, the same decoding procedure, etc. So we don't need to put a new classification network on our model. We don't need to decide on its architecture. We don't need to use a different learning rate, because in every single case, we're doing exactly the same task. We're taking text as input and producing text as output. At least that's the basic argument. Yeah?
Are the output vocabularies the same as well?
Yes. So we basically fix a vocabulary ahead of time that we generate based on our unlabeled data set, and we assume that we can, we're using sentence piece, so we can encode arbitrary pieces of text and, train the model in a purely sequence-to-sequence fashion. And so on the one hand, you can sort of view this as an engineering convenience because it simplifies the implementation. It's very easy to add a new task as long as you can cast it as a text-to-text problem, which I would argue, because we communicate in natural language, you probably can. But I would also say that the nice thing about this is it allows us to consider a lot of different tasks and try a lot of different ideas and figure out, again, sort of what works and what doesn't work. So that is sort of the T5 framework, and the T5 model itself is really just a basic, yes?
So I guess there's a trade-off here, right? Like your output space is much larger than what you would have if you model it as classification.
Yes.
Does that kind of play a role in the numbers that you see?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and something that we were worried and wondering about early on. But what we find is, these are very powerful models, and they learn very quickly that given the task prefix, like cola, it should never, ever, ever output anything except acceptable or not acceptable. So we have code in our evaluation pipeline that basically says if the model is supposed to output positive or negative and it outputs hamburger, then it gets it wrong. But we never had any situation where the model got it wrong after being fine-tuned. And we actually had a bug in that code so that if that had happened, it would have caused an exception, but we never saw the exception because it just never happened. And what we'll eventually show is that despite this sort of unusual way of allowing the model to output all kinds of stuff, but really only a couple things are valid, we actually end up getting state-of-the-art in many of these tasks, including the regression task STSB, which was a little surprising to me. Yeah.
Does the prefix indicate the data set or the task?
So in this case, we only have one task per data set. So they're kind of one and the same, but I would call it a task prefix, yes, because you could have, for example, the CNN Daily Mail corpus was also used as question answering. So, and it could, we just made up the task prefixes, so yeah. Yeah.
Are you fine-tuning the same model on all tasks, or do you have one fine-tuned model per task? Or
yes. Yeah. So I'll get to the sort of the pre-train and fine-tune pipeline, but yes, by the end of fine-tuning, we have n different models where n is the number of tasks. So we start from the same base pre-train model, and then we fine-tune on task A, and then separately we fine-tune on task B and task C. So by the end, it's not a multitask model. There's different parameter settings for each task.
But why do you need the co-op prefix if it's the only thing that you're ever going to show
Yeah.
is co-op?
Good question. Yeah. So we do include multitask experiments in our paper, and I'll talk about those a little later. And we also want to be able to support the multitask setting. So in the sort of strict unsupervised pre-training fine-tune on a single task, you're right that the task prefix might not be necessary. But because we're doing multitask in a couple places, kind of as part of our large-scale study, we want the task prefix to be there. But thanks, that's a good point. Cool. So as far as the model itself, it's really just a standard sort of vanilla encoder-decoder transformer. So basically as proposed in attention is all you need. We used relative position embeddings and sort of a scale-only layer normalization, but architecturally just basically as proposed in 2017. And so I won't say a lot more about it. So we have our model, and we kind of have the framework that we're going to use to train our model. And so the next major ingredient we need is the pre-training data set. And I think one of the reasons that this transfer learning recipe has been so successful is that we do unsupervised pre-training, and it's very easy to get a bunch of natural text from the internet because we all type in text to our computers and put it online. And so, for example, many people have used pages from Wikipedia as pre-training data, and So here are a bunch of random Wikipedia articles, and as you all know, there are many, many, many articles on Wikipedia. It's all very clean and natural text, so it's very easy to collect a big pre-training data set. But we actually wanted to experiment with some different factors of the pre-training data set, kind of experimenting with different domains, so not just Wikipedia articles. And we also wanted to be able to train the model for a very, very long time, potentially without repeating any of our unlabeled data. So what we did is grabbed a bunch of text from Common Crawl. So Common Crawl is a sort of non-commercial initiative to crawl the web and save snapshots of the web. And every month they put out a dump of web content on the order of 20 terabytes, depending on the month. And we basically took their dumped content and applied some filtering to it to create a new data set, sort of a filtered version of Common Crawl. So if we go to Common Crawl, we can download the web extracted text, which basically they apply some simple processing to the web pages to try to extract only the text, so not the markup, not the HTML. And you end up with stuff like this. So on the left, I have what a Wikipedia article might look like. In the middle, there is a product page that I made up for dried lemons. And then on the right, we have some placeholder text and some JavaScript code from kind of a nasty site. So the important thing I'm trying to emphasize here is that when you just go to Common Crawl and you download the web extracted text, you're going to get a lot of stuff that's not natural text. So menus, like I said, code, placeholder text, etc. So the main thing that we did was apply some pretty simple heuristic filtering to try to get natural text out. So the first thing that we did, very simple, was we removed any lines that didn't end in a terminal punctuation mark. So all of the menu text you tend to get rid of that. Get rid of that there. We removed any line with the word JavaScript because there's a lot of text on the internet that says, please enable JavaScript to use our site or something similar. So unfortunately, our model does not know anything about JavaScript. We also removed any page that had a curly bracket because curly brackets don't appear in natural text, but they often appear in code, and we don't want to train our model on code because none of the downstream tasks that we trained our model on are code-based. Another thing that we did that is quite important and non-trivial was to deduplicate the data set. So we basically took a sliding window of 3 sentence chunks and deduplicated it so that only one of them appeared in our data set. So this product page that I made up grabbed some of the text from the Wikipedia article and put it on the product page, and so that chunk of text gets deleted. And after all of this was said and done, we ended up with about 750 gigabytes of cleanish text. And specifically, we used LangDetect to detect that the web page was in English after cleaning it. And so we end up with about 750 gigabytes of cleanish English text. You could probably extract other languages if you had a nice language detector, but we decided to only pre-train the model on English, despite the fact that we are eventually doing some machine translation tasks. So one of the reasons we chose to use Common Crawl was that it's already publicly available. So we're basically taking this pre-existing object, the Common Crawl data set, and we are applying some cleaning to it, and anyone can do that. So anyone inside Google, outside Google, can download Common Crawl and apply exactly the same pre-processing that we did, because we also released the code to do the pre-processing. And the data set is already available in the TensorFlow datasets library. It takes a bit of time and compute to actually sort of churn through all of the data and produce this nugget, but yes, it is all publicly available. And we call it the Colossal Clean Crawled Corpus, C4. So great. So we have our framework, our model, architecture, our unlabeled data. So the next piece that we need is our unsupervised objective, which gives the model some way of learning from the unlabeled data. And so remember, our base model is an encoder-decoder transformer, so we need an objective that basically, or we want an objective that basically takes some text, probably does something to it, and then trains the model to predict some new text. And so we start with some clean text here, and we're just going to drop out some words, so corrupt them, and we will replace each span of dropped out words with a unique sentinel token. So if multiple words in a row get dropped out, we replace them with a single token. And the words are dropped out independently, uniformly at random. So for and inviting get replaced by a single sentinel token. And then the model is trained to output basically sentinel tokens to delineate the dropped out text that correspond to the text that was dropped out in the input, and then each span of dropped out text. And so this is pretty similar to the span BERT objective, and also the mass objective, and also similar to BERT's objective. It's sort of like a seek-to-seek version of the BERT objective. And so we kind of were just trying to come up with something that was not too different from standard practice, but worked well in our framework. And one of the things that we'll study in detail is the pretraining objective, and this one seems to work reasonably well. Yeah?
Do you have to do anything special with position embeddings?
No. So we basically count from left to right, including the tokens. So the model has to decide how many words to predict if a span was dropped out. Cool. So now, just to make it absolutely clear, this is kind of our general procedure for transfer learning that we use in our baseline and the majority of the experiments that I'll be talking about today. So the first thing we do is we pre-train a model, and for most of the experiments in the paper, we use a model that has a BERT-base-sized encoder and decoder. So BERT-base is the smaller of the two BERT-sized models that, the smaller of the two models that was proposed in the BERT paper. And so we basically take exactly the same architecture and size and use that in our encoder and our decoder in the transformer. And then we use this denoising objective that I just mentioned on the C4 data set and train the model for about 2 to the 19th steps on a batch size of about 65,000 tokens, which corresponds to about 34 billion tokens for pre-training, which is about a quarter as much as BERT used, just to give you a ballpark figure. Yeah?
Yeah, so going back to the motivation that you used, there was the fancy learn and fancier learn. So given that a lot of these settings are different from prior work, not to jump the gun, but how do you make comparisons with prior work?
Yeah, so it's rare in this paper that we exactly replicate an existing experimental setup because, yes, we're using an encoder-decoder model, our data set is new, etc. So our goal in this paper was not so much to exactly replicate experimental setups and more to test out ideas. So in many cases, we won't use exactly the same objective because the objective isn't necessarily applicable to our setting. Instead, we sort of take the idea proposed in the paper, for example, that bidirectionality matters, or that we should drop out spans instead of individual tokens, or that pre-training on this data set, this kind of data is better than pre-training on this kind of data, and we test that idea. So we rarely I would not ever say anything like the results in this paper are wrong, because we're not testing those results exactly. We're just testing which ideas are the most important or the most general that work well in our framework. So yeah, and then finally I'll just mention we use an inverse square root learning rate during pre-training with, then to answer your question, after pre-training, we fine-tune individually on a suite of downstream tasks. So first of all, we use all the tasks in the GLUE benchmark, which is a set of tasks that are supposed to test general language understanding capabilities, and they're all basically classification tasks. So text as input, class label as output. We measured performance on the CNN Daily Mail summarization, which, as I mentioned before, takes a news article as input and tries to output a short summary of it. We also use the SQUAD question answering data set, which is a span-based question answering data set on Wikipedia. In our case, again, since we're doing text-to-text tasks, we just predict the text of the answer. We also evaluated on the SuperGLUE benchmark, which is similar to GLUE in many ways, except that it was designed after GLUE in hopes of being more difficult, basically. So given that the performance on GLUE at the time that SuperGLUE was proposed was roughly at human level, and now it's substantially above human level, they wanted to propose a benchmark of harder tasks that BERT specifically could not cannot do very well. And so it includes a similar collection of tasks. I should have mentioned earlier, glue includes natural language inference tasks, pronoun resolution. Superglue also has a couple of question answering tasks. Linguistic acceptability. It's kind of a pretty wide suite of ideas if you haven't come across it, which I think many of you have. And then finally, we also, as I mentioned earlier, fine-tune on translation. So this is a standard seek-to-seek task, text as input, translated text as output. When we fine-tune on every task, we fine-tune for 2 to the 18 steps, so half as long as we pre-trained. And we just use a constant learning rate during fine-tuning. And then to report performance, we take all of the checkpoints that we saved during fine-tuning, evaluate the validation set performance, and pick the best one. So we do this for all of the models in exactly the same way. That's kind of how we do early stopping. Some of these data sets don't need to be fine-tuned for that long, so by doing this sort of post-hoc early stopping, that's how we train for less long effectively. Cool. So today in our paper and today in this talk, I'll present results in a table that looks like this. So in the columns, we have the performance on each individual task, and I won't mention too much specifics as far as the metrics used in each task, except I'll just say that higher is better on all of them, and I'm happy to drill down on a specific task if you want. And the rows show different experimental settings. So for example, just to give you an idea of the general performance that we'll be looking at for many of these experiments, the first row is if we just take the base experimental setup exactly as I described it and report the performance. So that's shown on this top row here. The second row, if we run the baseline 10 times and get a standard deviation of the scores, those are the standard deviations that we get. And on the final row, we report the performance of not doing any pre-training. So just taking the same model, fine-tuning it for 2 to the 18 steps, and reporting the performance there. That's the performance we get. And as you can see, as we all have sort of internalized by this point, in most cases, pre-training can help significantly for many of these tasks. And I'll just point a couple of things out. The first is that our results on glue and squad are pretty similar to what Bert got. So we train for a quarter as long, but we train on a more diverse data set, and we end up with about similar results to a Bert base, I should say. In all of the tables, when we report performance, we will put a star next to our baseline. So we'll report the baseline multiple times, and every time you see the baseline, you'll see a little star like we're showing here. And whenever a score on any of the benchmarks is within 1 standard deviation of the best score for that benchmark in the table, we will put it in boldface. And basically, for compute reasons, we're going to reuse the standard deviation for the baseline for every experimental setting. And this, we're basically assuming that if I change one piece of my experimental setup, the standard deviation of the model's performance is not going to change much. And that's simply because if we were to run all of these experiments 10 times or 4 times, it would result in a massively more computational cost that we cannot feasibly do. The final thing I'll point out on this specific table is that, as I mentioned, the performance of pre-training then fine-tuning is substantially better than skipping pre-training on all tasks except WMT English French, which has a very large training data set. And so we're actually mostly including that task to see, does pre-training ever hurt? If you have enough data for the model to learn all it needs to know from the supervised training data, should you still use pre-training? Would it hurt? So this is kind of a little bit of a silly task to include here just because the supervised training data set is so big. But as you can see here, it doesn't really hurt performance. So I've kind of mentioned this already, but I just want to make a couple of disclaimers about the results in the study and in the paper. The first being, as I mentioned earlier, that we're not replicating exactly anyone else's experimental setup. We're just trying to test out ideas. And if anyone feels like we didn't capture the idea or the spirit behind the proposed method correctly, I'd love to hear about that, and we can try to maybe run another experiment or at least update our language in the paper to that effect. And our basic approach, as I mentioned, is to take this baseline and perturb it along some axis. So for example, we're going to take the baseline exactly as it stands, and we're just going to train it for longer. or we're going to take the baseline as it stands, and we're just going to change the pre-training data set. And in basically no case will we change multiple things at once until the very end when we try to combine all of our best ideas. And again, that's because if we wanted to test every pre-training data set with every unsupervised objective and every model architecture, we'd get a combinatorial explosion of the number of experiments we need to run, and training these models takes a significant amount of compute, so we can't really do that. And if you combined multiple factors, you might find that this pre-training objective works better with this pre-training data set, but we haven't tested that directly in this paper. So this should be taken as sort of a first step. And I should also mention that we did compare a lot of ideas, but there's no way that we could be totally comprehensive. There were many new ideas and papers published in the last year. So we just kind of tried to pick out sort of the most different and influential ones, at least at a high level. And finally, we also did minimal hyperparameter tuning. So if we changed the pre-training data set, we didn't change the learning rate, for example. And again, this is for the same reason. If we reran these experiments, they would just end up costing a bunch. So you can kind of, if you did really good hyperparameter tuning, one of the methods might come out on top that didn't before. So those are all the asterisks on these experiments. Hopefully you'll all still find them interesting and useful. So the first thing I'll talk about are different model architectures. And to introduce this part, I'll just give a quick review for those of you who aren't familiar about masking in transformers. So transformers use self-attention throughout their model, and to control whether the model is sort of processing context or producing output, we modify the attention mask. And the attention mask determines which entries in the input the model is allowed to attend to when producing the output. So on the left, we have a fully visible mask where every output entry is able to see every input entry. In the middle, there's a causal mask, which is good for predicting a sequence. So the model's not allowed to look into the future when it's predicting the sequence. And finally, this one is maybe a little less common. It's what we would call a causal mask with a prefix. So that basically says the model is allowed to look at the first bit of the input sequence with full visibility, and then it has to start predicting what comes next later on in the input sequence. So to apply these three masks, here are three model architectures that we looked at. The first is the basic transformer encoder-decoder model. The second is a sort of standard language model that uses causal masking throughout. And the final is a language model with a prefix, where basically we say, we're going to give the model some context as a prefix, and then we're going to ask the model to start predicting stuff. And so in particular, the encoder-decoder model is typically used for language modeling, sequence-to-sequence task. Language modeling is used for next step prediction, and the prefix language model can be used for sequence-to-sequence tasks by basically giving the model the input for the first chunk, giving it fully visible attention for the first chunk, and then asking the model to predict the output from there on out. So I'll now mention the performance of these different architectures. The first is the encoder-decoder, and that's actually our baseline. And in this table, you'll see the second and third column where we give a rough estimate of the number of parameters in the model and the model's cost. So considering a language model to have p parameters and cost m, we basically report how much more or less parameters or cost does this model have in terms of sort of idealized flops. So our encoder-decoder model has two p parameters because it has an encoder stack and a decoder stack. And here's the performance it gets. Since it has two p parameters, we were interested to see what happens if we share all of the parameters in the encoder and the decoder. So the parameters are completely copied between the encoder and the decoder, except for the encoder-decoder attention. And that basically cuts the parameter count in half. And surprisingly, what we found is that it doesn't actually hurt performance very much to do that for most of these tasks. And of course, the cost doesn't really change because you're processing the sequence in exactly the same way. Another way to cut the parameter count in half is to make it less deep. So instead of training a 12-layer encoder and a 12-layer decoder, as we would do with a BERT-based size encoder and decoder, we train a 6-layer encoder and a 6-layer decoder. And that actually does hurt performance significantly. It also reduces the computation cost by a factor of 2. So next up is the language model, and as we all, especially you all with Elmo, have sort of internalized by now, bidirectional context is very useful, so using a language model pre-training objective, sure enough, does hurt us significantly. And finally, using the prefix language model also does hurt somewhat, and surprisingly actually generally does a little bit worse than the shared encoder-decoder, at least in our text-to-text framework. But does significantly better than the language model. So again, unsurprisingly, giving the model bidirectional context on the input is valuable. Cool. So next up are pre-training objectives. So on the top here, I'm sort of showing a flow chart of the experiments that we ran. So the first set of experiments we ran were comparing sort of high-level pre-training approaches, things that people had tried in the past that are quite different from each other. The first being language modeling with a prefix. So I'm taking the sentence, "Thank you for inviting me to your party last week," and showing how it might be pre-processed using one of these objectives. Yeah?
Sorry, just about the previous slide. How do you share parameters between the encoder and decoder? Don't they have different architectures,
So,
transformer blocks?
yeah, so the architecture is exactly the same because they're both BERT-based sized. So all the shapes are exactly the same. The only thing that's different is the encoder to decoder attention mechanisms, which take up a relatively small number of parameters in the whole model, so those aren't shared. So it's not exactly 2p to p, it's like 2p to 1.1p or something, but roughly speaking, that's how it works. Thanks. Okay, yeah, so in the bottom here, we have examples of how an example would be pre-processed. So thank you for inviting would be the input for a prefix language model, and then me to your party last week would be what the model's trained to predict. We also have a BERT-style objective, which takes words and replaces them with mask tokens, and then also replaces words with a random different word. And we just trained the model to predict the original text. And finally, we also considered a deshuffling objective where we just take the input, shuffle it randomly, and try to predict the original text. So comparing these three, sure enough, the BERT-style objective works best. We do quite a bit better than the prefix language modeling objective, and actually surprisingly a lot better than the deshuffling objective. So again, this should not be super surprising. The next thing we wanted to ask was, in BERT, we take words, we replace them with mask tokens. Sometimes we randomly replace them with different tokens. What happens if we have a different corruption strategy? So a different way of replacing words. So in all of these cases, we are making a IID decision uniformly at random to decide whether we should corrupt a word or not. So in the first objective, which is similar to mass, if you have seen that work, we basically only mask tokens. We don't ever swap tokens randomly like BERT does. In the second case, which is actually our baseline objective, if multiple tokens are masked out, we replace them with a single sentinel token. So that's the baseline objective I talked about earlier. And in the last example, we actually just drop them completely. So we don't replace them with mask tokens, we don't replace them with sentinels, we just remove them completely. So comparing the performance of these things, we have the BERT style on the top, which we just saw, the mass style, replacing the spans and dropping the tokens. And what we found was, at least in the text-to-text framework, replacing spans or dropping spans completely both resulted in a pre-trained model that had better performance on downstream tasks. And maybe that's because the model has to decide how many words it needs to produce, and maybe that's a little harder. The other advantage here is that the model, at least in these cases, is trained to predict fewer tokens, so pre-training goes faster because you're dropping, instead of predicting the entire original input, we're just predicting the missing tokens.
And here, sorry, you don't tell the model where the tokens have been dropped.
So in the drop corrupted tokens, we don't. Yes, we just remove them, and the sentence sort of looks like this. It just doesn't really make sense, and the model has to decide which words we're missing in order. And that actually works totally reasonably well. So I will do this occasionally on these tables, especially on glue and super glue. These are average scores across all of the scores in the benchmark. So when something happens individually to one of those tasks, it can get hidden in the average score. So that happened here. You can see the glue score for dropping tokens is actually significantly better than the glue score for replacing corrupted tokens. And we have a giant table at the end of our paper that shows the numbers for all of the benchmarks for all of the experiments. And so if you go down and look at that table, you would see that for COLA, on Corpus of Linguistic Acceptability, the score for dropping tokens is significantly higher, and by about 10 points, which is a lot in this benchmark. And that bumps up the score by about 1 for the glue benchmark. And maybe one reason that happens is that if you drop tokens from the original input, the model is seeing a lot of linguistically unacceptable pre-training data, and so maybe it does better on the downstream task. Just a guess, not a rigorous, I have no way of explaining that in more detail. On the other hand, replacing corrupted spans does significantly better on the superglue task than dropping corrupted tokens. On COPA, which is the collection of plausible alternatives, I don't think it's the corpus. In that data set or that task, we're basically asked to explain why a sentence happened. I don't have a good explanation of why the replacing corrupted spans does better on that task, but that's how we can explain these big bumps in performance here. So next up, so far we have been dropping 15% of the tokens in the input. What happens if we drop a different proportion of tokens in the input using our standard baseline objective? We can see that, roughly speaking, if we drop 10 to 25% of the tokens, the performance is pretty similar. If we drop 50% of the tokens, the performance gets significantly worse. So this is not a very sensitive hyperparameter, but we chose 15 in our baseline, and that seems like an okay choice. The final thing that we measured, given a good corruption rate, was what happens when we drop entire spans. So rather than making an IID decision for each token, we basically, at each position in the input, we say, should I drop a span of tokens, and how long should that span be? So this approach was proposed by a paper called SpanBERT, and here's an example of what that might look like. What ultimately ends up happening is you just end up with more chunks that you have to predict rather than individual words. And we do this at the very end because it needs to know not only how often this should happen, but also what the average span length should be. So if we compare 4 different average span lengths, you can see here again that it's not super sensitive to these different span lengths, and it performs pretty similarly to the baseline unless you drop really big spans, in which case the performance gets significantly worse. So at a very high level, to summarize these objective experiments, the most important thing that we found, which is pretty well known already, was that sort of the word corruption objectives tend to work best, and that once you're in the right ballpark as far as how much to corrupt, they tend to work pretty similarly. And so given that, what we suggest and what we try to do is to use objectives that result in short target sequences, because as I mentioned earlier, if the target sequence is shorter, it's cheaper to do pre-training. So that's kind of the main takeaway from those experiments. Next up, comparing pre-training data sets. So far we've been using the C4 data set, which I introduced earlier, which gives this baseline performance here. So one obvious question to ask is, what happens to the performance if we, oh, did you have a question? Okay, cool. What happens if we don't do any of the filtering? So no deduplication, no removing lines that don't end in a period, etc. And what we find, unsurprisingly, is that the performance on all of the downstream tasks get worse. And probably that's because the model is sort of wasting capacity learning to model unnatural text, and all of these data sets, all of these downstream tasks are tasks on downstream text. So learning how to process code or placeholder text is not that useful. So that's nice, the filtering does help. The next thing we looked at was what happens if we pre-train the model only on news data. And so we used the same list of articles that we used in the Grover paper to create a data set that we are saying is real news-like, because basically we just took C4 and we threw out any page that didn't come from a news website. And there's this sort of big list of news websites that we used and the Grover paper used. And the idea here is that this is a much more constrained domain than general natural text on the web. And how does that affect performance? And you can see in general the performance is somewhat similar on most of the tasks. It's a little different on glue and superglue, and I'll mention why we think that is in a minute. The next thing we did was measure the performance on a web text-like data set. So this is supposed to be similar to the data set that was used in the GPT-2 paper, where they only retained a website if it was posted to Reddit and received at least a score of 3. So we did the same thing. We got all of the websites, the URLs that were posted to Reddit and received a score of at least 3, and we threw out any content in C4 that didn't come from one of those websites. So the motivation behind this idea was to retain only higher quality text, and doing this additional filtering step did help performance on Glue, and again, I'll come back to that in a minute. But overall, we didn't have a giant impact compared to just using all the text. The next thing we looked at was just using data from Wikipedia, which is a very common other pre-training data source. This does on par, maybe slightly worse than C4. And finally, we also looked at Wikipedia plus the Toronto Books Corpus. So just some high-level takeaways. Sorry, and I should mention the Toronto Books Corpus is a collection of novel text that someone scraped from the internet somewhat surreptitiously at some point in the past. So here are some quick takeaways, because I kind of rushed through that. So the first thing that I want to point out is that these sort of in the smaller domain data sets, real news, web text like Wikipedia, and Toronto Books, because they're doing additional filtering, they're smaller. They're an order of magnitude smaller, I should say, not orders of magnitude. As far as individual performance, the high-level point that we'll make here is that pre-training on in-domain data helps downstream task performance. So for example, if we pre-train our model on real news, then it does significantly better on record. Record is a question-answering data set on news articles. So if we pre-train the model on news, it tends to do better on a news question-answering task, for example. Similarly, we had the best score on the superglue benchmark on multi-RC, which is also a question-answering data set that includes some data from novels. So by adding novels from the Toronto Books Corpus, we do significantly better there. Interestingly, pre-training on Wikipedia made the model do much worse on COLA, which again is the corpus of linguistic acceptability. Maybe Wikipedia is so clean that it's never seen unacceptable text before, and that hurts performance. Who knows? But the high-level point is that pre-training on in-domain data tends to be helpful. So as far as the data set size, yeah?
Can you go back to the slide?
Sure.
So, I mean, this is really remarkable in my view, because you're basically seeing that training on one, if not more, order of magnitude fewer data leads to similar performance on the training video.
Yeah, let me mention really quickly that although the data set is bigger, we don't iterate through the whole data set. So actually in all of these cases in our baseline, we only make it through these last 4 data sets a couple of times, and we don't make it through C4 even once. But if we were going to pre-train the model for much longer, like for example, Roberta pre-trains their model for I think 64 times as long, or maybe 128 times as long, we would start to repeat the data. So I recognize that that's unclear in this slide, but the point is not to look at the data set size in terms of the training length, because the training length is all the same. So then I think to answer this question more directly, we measured what happens if we repeat pre-training data. So if I wanted to train my model for 100 times longer, but my data set was so small that I would end up repeating it 100 times, would that hurt me? And the basic answer is yes. If you repeat it enough times. So if we use the full data set with our baseline, we never repeat it. We never get through the full data set with our baseline number of tokens. If we repeat it 64 times or 256 times, it doesn't hurt performance very much. But if we repeat it 1,000 times, it does. And actually at the end of, in the final set of experiments we do, if we pre-trained our model on Wikipedia or real news or web text like, we would repeat the data set over 1,000 times. And when in this final set of experiments, we actually do less pre-training than Roberta. So I guess the high-level point is, if you aren't going to be pre-training for that long, you might not have to worry about this. But if you start to repeat your data set a bunch of times, the model can start to memorize your pre-training data set, and you actually see a significant drop in performance on your downstream tasks. Does that make sense? Great. And we're just showing the training loss here just to show that it fits the data set better, which probably actually just means that it's memorizing it. OK, the next chunk of experiments I'll mention are our multitask experiments. We basically are interested in saying what happens if instead of doing unsupervised pre-training and fine-tuning, we try to train one model on a bunch of tasks at once. So in order to train the model on a bunch of tasks at once, the main consideration is how often do we train on each task. So for example, the simplest thing we can do is train on each task uniformly. So including the pre-training unsupervised task, and now it's not pre-training anymore, but including the unsupervised task, we basically sample data from each task uniformly at random. So and that actually results in significantly worse performance. The next option is to weight each data set by the number of examples in the data set. The reason we might want to do that is we don't want to overfit small data sets and underfit big data sets. So we did that, except that because our our unsupervised task is so big, we need to set an artificial limit on how much we train on that task and on any task. And so that we're calling K. We're basically saying if the data set has more than K examples, pretend like it had K examples. And in that case, we actually start to get somewhat similar performance to the pre-train and fine-tune setting when you set K correctly. And just as a final example, this is what multilingual BERT does to sample from different languages. We can also take these number of example proportions and apply a temperature to them to kind of make them more close to uniform. And if we do that, we also can get not too far off from the performance of pre-training and fine-tuning. But especially on glue and squad and superglue, we see a significant drop in performance when trying to train a single model on all these tasks at once. So then the question is there any way to close this gap? So again, this is kind of the setting that we've used so far. We pre-train on the unsupervised task and fine-tune on each individual downstream task. If we do multitask training, here's what we're basically training on all the tasks at once. So this is kind of the best result from the table I just showed. One thing we can do, which is what MTDNN does, is we pre-train on a multitask mixture, and then we fine-tune on each individual task. And if we do that, we actually basically close the gap with unsupervised pre-training and fine-tuning. It doesn't do significantly better, but it does roughly as good. A natural question that arises when doing that is what happens if I pre-train on a multitask mixture and then fine-tune on a task I didn't see during pre-training? So we call this leave one out fine-tuning. And this hurts performance a little bit, but not too much, which suggests that you still get a pretty good pre-trained model by pre-training on a supervised mixture. And then the final thing that we tried was pre-training only on supervised tasks. So this is more similar to what we do in computer vision. We don't do unsupervised pre-training usually. We just pre-train on supervised tasks, and then we fine-tune on the same set of supervised tasks in this case. And that actually hurts performance pretty significantly. So in NLP, sort of maybe unlike computer vision, it actually can be super beneficial to do this unsupervised pre-training step. Yeah?
So it kind of looks like multitask learning doesn't work. Is it possible that it's because of your prefix? You made everything a sequence to sequence, which constrained your sort of model class. What if instead you had these different multiple heads that were actually per task? Would that maybe have different performance?
The closest thing that it might, and also the other thing I'll mention is that the mixing rate seems to be the most important factor. We might just not have set the mixing rates appropriately. The closest thing that we did to answering your question is using what are called task adapters, which are kind of submodules in the network, which are trained to each task individually. And I don't have those results in this slide, but they are in the paper, and that also tended to hurt performance, at least in our setup. Great. So the last set of, and I recognize that I'm pretty close, just a couple minutes left, so I'll go through this last bit pretty quickly. The last set of experiments we considered are what happens when you scale the model up. And the premise behind these experiments is I'm going to give you 4 times as much compute. How should you use it? Should you train the model for longer? Should you use a bigger batch size? Should you train a bigger model? Should you train 4 models and ensemble them? And so here's what happened. So if you train the model 4 times longer, you can either, or I should say on 4 times as much data, we pre-train 4 times as long and we fine-tune 4 times as long. And sure enough, the performance does get significantly better, especially on glue and superglue and squad. So this can be obviously an effective way of getting better performance, and that was one of the main things that Roberta did to get better performance, was basically just pre-train the model for longer. So this is a great way to use additional compute. The next thing we did, of course, was make the model bigger. So we first considered what happens if you make the model twice as big, and we made it both deeper and wider in this experiment. And you train it 2 times as long. So that's 4 times as much compute. That helps quite a bit. It also helps just making the model 4 times bigger. And both of these things produce pretty significant gains. For example, on superglue, we went from a score of 71 to 78 just by making the model 4 times bigger. So then in our last set of experiments for scaling, we say, what happens if we train 4 models and ensemble them? So this is kind of a hidden way of using additional compute because people typically are less likely to emphasize their parameter count than they are the number of ensembles or the number of ensembled models that they use. And this also can help a lot. It gave us the best results that we had on CNN Daily Mail. And we also, just as a sort of side experiment, pre-trained 1 model and then fine-tuned it 4 times to create a fine-tune only ensemble. And that also helps a bit, but not quite as much as training 4 completely separate models. Okay, and then for the last bit, we did what I mentioned earlier, which is we took all the insights from our big study, combined them all, and then also added quite a bit of scale. So just to mention what we ended up using, we used the same encoder-decoder architecture. We used the span prediction objective that I mentioned at the end of the objective experiments. We used the base C4 data set so that we avoid repeating data 1,000 times. We actually used multitask pre-training in these experiments, actually not because we thought it would give us better performance, but because the nice thing about it is it gives you a measure of how well your model is doing before you do fine-tuning. So some of these models took a week or 2 to train, and we wanted to know how things were going during pre-training. And since multitask pre-training didn't hurt compared to unsupervised pre-training, we decided to use multitask pre-training in these experiments. And finally, of course, we trained bigger models for longer to see sort of how far we can push the current limits. Specifically, we trained these 5 variants. First, a model that was significantly smaller than our baseline, then a model that was a good bit bigger, and then 2 pretty giant models, one with 3 billion parameters and one with 11 billion parameters. And these last 2 models, actually, to make them big, all we did was made the feed-forward layers wide. We made them super, super wide. So this is a comically simple way of making your model bigger. All you're doing is stuffing a bunch more parameters in the feed-forward layers. They're not deeper. They don't have more. They don't have a bigger representation in the attention heads or anything like that. It's just way, 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 way wider. And so when we combined all of these ideas and scaled things up, we ended up getting state-of-the-art on all of the tasks that we consider, not all of the tasks, on all of the benchmarks we considered, not all of the glue and superglue subtasks, but unfortunately not on translation. So for translation, it seems like back translation, which is a very important ingredient for these state-of-the-art results, works better than the English-only pre-training that we used, which is interesting. Good thing to be aware of. The other thing I'll mention is that on superglue, which I said earlier was designed to be hard for BERT but easy for humans, we actually got very close to the human level performance. Again, basically by taking existing ingredients and scaling them up, which was a bit surprising to me at least. I should also mention that we posted this paper at the end of October, and some of these results have now been beaten. But we actually have also beaten some of our results and their results just by being a little more careful with how we select checkpoints. But those results will be online in a couple of weeks. It's nothing exciting. So I'm just going to wrap up now by saying that all of our code is available online, as well as all of our model checkpoints. And we also recently put a Colab online. So Colab is like a Jupyter notebook that runs on an external kernel. If you use a Colab, you also get a free cloud TPU to run stuff on. So that's all the long way of saying that if you want to take one of our models and fine-tune it on your task of choice, you can do that for free in your web browser. And in this example, we're showing basically what we call context-free question answering. So I just ask the model a question, give it no context, and it has to try to answer it. So it's like a pub quiz. It's like a trivia. And it takes a couple of hours to train the 3 billion parameter model on a free cloud TPU, and it does surprisingly well, better than I would do. So yeah, check that out if you want to give it a try. And yeah, so here's again the team that I worked with on this, and I recognize again that I went over by a couple minutes, so happy to answer questions offline or via email or whenever. So thanks for all your questions during the talk.